There is a garden, there is a city, and there's a kingdom of God. And it is beautiful, and he is bringing it right now into our midst.
One day, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that I am?" After hearing their answers, Jesus said, "Who do you say I am?" We are still asking that question 2,000 years later. Jesus has been called a wild Messiah, described as disruptive, extravagant, and playful, gentle and dangerous, full of generous grace and unrelenting truth. He is the lion and the lamb. He is a comforting counselor in one encounter and a fiery prophet in the next. He hangs out with the poor, the sick, the outcast, and the misfits. He touches them, heals them, forgives them, changes them. He speaks about an upside-down kingdom of God. He prays to a Father in heaven with unthinkable intimacy. He challenges all the established power brokers of his day. He teaches in plain words that are so practical, and then speaks with mystery and paradox that leave us wondering what he is trying to say. He calls everyone to a radical commitment and offers them everything in return. You can't control him. You can't reduce him. You can't tame him. You can't predict what he will do. You can only hang on for the ride of your life and find out how far he will take you. He is not your Sunday school Messiah. He may be the Jesus you never knew. He is the Jesus you need to know. reJesus. Stories, words, encounters.
2,000 years ago, Jesus appeared on the scene. And 2,000 years later, he is still calling us. He is still fascinating us. We are still intrigued by Jesus. And his very first crowds, as they began to experience him for the first time, they were amazed at what Jesus taught. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, some of the very well-known teaching of Jesus, read by people all over the world. Jesus says some things that people had not heard before, and when we come to the end of that chapter, when he had finished the teaching, we read that the crowds were simply amazed at what they had been listening to by this one called Jesus. They had not heard somebody teaching with this kind of authority, this kind of passion, this kind of wisdom before. They were just simply amazed at the things that Jesus said. You flip one chapter later to Matthew chapter 8, and now we're not looking at the crowds, but we're looking at the disciples, and they had been seeing Jesus do some pretty extraordinary things, and they're going to now experience something even more extraordinary. They are in a boat, they are crossing the lake to go to the other side, and this furious storm comes up. It's a very unusual phrase. It's just talking about it is a tempest, it is a gale of an event, and the boat is being tossed, the wind, the waves, and there's Jesus sleeping, and the disciples frantically wake him up and say, "Jesus, we are about to die." And Jesus gets up, and with words, he literally calms the furious storm. And the disciples are looking at one another and say, what kind of man is this that he speaks words that calm the storm? They're just amazed at this one called Jesus. 2,000 years ago, Jesus began to amaze people. He's still doing that. We are fascinated by Jesus. His presence is everywhere. The ongoing interest in Jesus is everywhere. We're still making movies about Jesus. There's been a remake of a movie for a couple decades ago, The Last Temptation of Christ. It was just a remake, not so much a movie, but a Broadway play. It's a remake. And then the books about Jesus. There's no individual that has had more books written about him than the one called Jesus. Now, if you start to do some other research on a couple of historical characters like Lincoln, Napoleon, Shakespeare, they're right there at the top of the charts in terms of how many books have been written about them. I think I like some of the studies that say Lincoln is the one who's been written about more than any other person. And there's about 17,000 books written in English about Abraham Lincoln. If you go and do an Amazon search, you're going to find about 7,000 mentions in books for Abraham Lincoln. Then you do a search in books for Jesus, and you're going to find there are 400,000 mentions. I mean, there's no comparison. By far and away, he just blows the competition into nothingness by the sheer amount that we have written about Jesus. When it comes to art, there's no person that has been painted or drawn more often than this one called Jesus. We are mesmerized by him. We want to see Jesus. In fact, that's actually the words that come from one of the gospel stories in the Gospel of John. There are some Greeks, not Jews, but there are some Greeks, and they've been hearing some things about Jesus, and they come to one of the disciples of Jesus. His name is Philip, and they come to Philip and say, hey, Philip, sir, we would like to see this one called Jesus. And we've been hearing about him. He's intriguing. There's something that's stirring inside of us. We would like to see Jesus. Then and now, we still are those people who want to see Jesus. 2,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Something more than extraordinary happened. An individual named Jesus of Nazareth entered human history. And in fact, we just wound up celebrating his birth at churches all around the world. 2,000 years ago, he entered human history. For 30 years, he moves into kind of a period of waiting, a silence, where we just don't know anything, of almost nothing about what was going on for Jesus. And then at age 30, he appears, and for the next 3.5 years, the things he does and the things he says and the way he interacts and the claims he makes and the challenges, it is simply mind-boggling, extraordinary, astonishing in its scope and power. I mean, Jesus wowed the crowds. He delighted the crowds. He astonished the crowds. And at times, he made some people a little bit fearful. He also gathered some enemies who didn't like at all who he was, what he was doing, what he was saying. And eventually, those enemies conspired together to kill him. And all the accounts confirm that he was indeed killed and he was indeed put into a tomb. And 3 days later, something most amazing of all happened. And everybody agrees it happened. They just don't know. They don't always explain together why it happened. But the tomb was empty. The tomb was found to be devoid of the person named Jesus who had been placed in it. It was an empty tomb. And we've been arguing about, what exactly happened there ever since then. But there is unmistakable fact the tomb was empty. Now, have you heard of the language of black swan event? Have you heard that language before? It's been invented by some economists, some sociologists, and what it refers to is the appearance of something unusual, something unanticipated, something unexpected, something really, really out of the norm. A black swan event is something that you didn't predict, you didn't anticipate, it just happens, and now it makes everything different. Jesus was the black swan event of human history. So unexpected, so unanticipated, and so absolutely game-changing. Literally, it changed history. Now, it didn't start out that big. It started out with a few followers. It changed a few followers. And those followers changed by this black swan event called Jesus, and in particular, his death and his resurrection, but substantiated by his teachings and wisdom and way. And they went forth and they began to take this black swan event called Jesus everywhere that they went. And within 100 years, this fringe movement of followers of Jesus were becoming so compelling, so widespread that the entire Mediterranean world was being turned upside down. The black swan event called Jesus was literally changing human history. It was like there had been this deep sea eruption that sent these tidal waves crashing through the centuries and washing over the world, and that living water is gathering right here still today at a place called Living Word Community Church, and we soak in this thing called Jesus Christ. He's still grabbing hold of us. He is still astonishing us. We are still intrigued by, called by, drawn by, and sometimes a little put off by this one called Jesus. Jesus wound up asking his disciples after he had been doing ministry for a little while. He said, "Well, who do the people say that I am?" Let me read the passage here for you. It comes from Matthew chapter 16. So when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he had been some other places doing some pretty striking things. He asked his disciples, "Who do the people say that the Son of Man is?" Now, by the way, they're going to give a couple of pretty striking responses. So, who do the people think I am? What are they saying about me? What's the word on the street? And here are a couple of things that they say. Well, some say that you are John the Baptist. And in another gospel, like John the Baptist risen from the dead, because John the Baptist, fiery forerunner prophet that he was, had been killed. And some people say, has John come back to life? Is a spirit possessing this one called Jesus? Jesus reminds us a little bit, but others say Elijah, who is this miracle worker of the Old Testament. Jesus reminded them of Elijah. And then some say, well, Jeremiah, one of these bold prophets that spoke the words we needed to hear. And they're all decent answers, but that's the word on the street. And then Jesus turns to his disciples who are a lot closer and says, how about you? Who do you say that I am? How are you experiencing me? Who am I to you? And then we read that Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, hey, Simon, you are really, really blessed because you didn't figure that one out on your own. You got a word from my Father in heaven, cluing you in on who I really am. And they kind of say, okay, guys, we're going to keep quiet about this for a while. Keep quiet about it. We can't let anybody know this. It's too risky to get that word out on the street. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So, who do you say Jesus is? What's our world saying Jesus is? I like artwork. Artwork helps me sort of crystallize some things that I am thinking. Here's one of the images that got hold of me a long time ago. This is the picture of Jesus, gentle Jesus, very clean Jesus, patient, kind, gentle Jesus, knocking on the door of my life. But actually, that was on the cover of the Bible that I read as a kid. Didn't read it much as a kid. And when I went to college, I found that my mother had snuck that Bible into my suitcase. And there was gentle knocking on the door of my life, Jesus. A little later, I'd become a follower of Jesus in my college years, and I found this particular picture of Jesus, and what it was on the flip side of the Lord's Prayer, and I really liked that, and I had a little thing I carried around for me for a while, and that picture, it was just something about that I liked, but as years went by, that one seemed a little bit too clean, a little bit too sanitized, a little bit too perfect, and I found myself being drawn to this particular image where there was a more rugged Jesus, a more kind of manly Jesus, if you will. He needed a shave, but there's something strong and striking about his presence. Movie makers have been interested in Jesus forever. One of the very first movies was in 1927. It was a silent movie. It's called King of the Kings. But notice how whitewashed Jesus is. I mean, DeMille wanted to capture Jesus as a sort of heavenly, almost ethereal presence making his way through the real world. That was a silent movie. There wasn't any dialogue in it. And then The Last Temptation of Christ was one of the most popular movies at one time, but very frowned upon by a lot of Christians because really it wound up portraying Jesus as kind of a sexually frustrated, repressed prophet who never quite got it together. And then there was Godspell of Jesus, where Jesus was a little bit clownish. Although a little bit later, I'm going to tell you that there is a prayer and a song from Godspell that is still very, very powerful, and I use it all the time. But that was a significant movie back in its day. And then, of course, Jesus Christ Superstar, which ironically, do you know that in this particular movie, Judas Iscariot has actually more lines of dialogue than Jesus Christ? And some reviewers say the movie should have been called Judas Iscariot Superstar because Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, seemed to have more presence in that particular movie. And then, of course, here was the updated version with John Legend doing the Broadway play. And kind of a fun little side point about that, they got Alice Cooper to play the role of King Herod. And actually Alice Cooper said that was on his bucket list to be involved in some kind of movie or performance about Jesus. And then there's the movie The Son of God. And some people say, hey, that was dreamy Jesus. Isn't he good looking? Man, you put some blue contact lenses on him, and man, it's like, but come on. It's like, it looks like he never goes out of his house. And then there's Marxist Jesus. And then there is Buddhist Jesus. And then there is the Eastern guru Jesus that Deepak Chopra said Jesus spent many of his years in obscurity traveling to the East and being enlightened. And of course, it's pure nonsense because there's nothing in the Gospels that's even close to the ways of the Eastern religions. But for him, Jesus was this Eastern guru. And Dan Brown was even worse. Jesus turned out to be nothing more than a wise teacher who settled down, married, had a couple kids, and was never crucified. Now, I remember when that book came out, and Pastor Steve and I, we were reading it, and people were reading it, and it was amazing, the uproar about that particular book. But what was pretty striking is 1 out of 6 people who read that book came away believing that everything Dan Brown said about Jesus was true. And what I'd like you to know, and I'm not going to even go into this in any kind of detail, but any serious historian, whether they call themselves Christian or not, will say most of what Dan Brown wrote is nothing but fictionalized nonsense. And yet he wrote a very compelling tale, and lots of people said, well, I think that's who Jesus was, just a great teacher, and his descendants are still living someplace hidden in Europe. And then there's angry Jesus. I think he's angry because he read Dan Brown's book about him. I don't know. But, some people is always going around, Jesus is kind of angry at us. Don't make me angry. You won't like me when I'm angry. Jesus doesn't say that. Who actually says that? Yeah, well, Bruce Banner, because before he becomes a Hulk, you don't want Jesus hulking out on you, do you? But there's angry Jesus, and then there's buddy Jesus. Okay, now listen, I'm showing this just because these things are out there in our culture. Hey, Jesus, our buddy. And here's how trivialized Jesus can become. We've turned him into bobblehead Jesus. And hipster Jesus. I kind of like that scarf he's wearing, don't you? Somebody like you'd meet at Starbucks. I'm sorry, I mean at the Southside Cafe. And then this image I actually like. This is a portrayal of black Jesus, and I like it when various races and nationalities try to envision Jesus who's not just lily white European and kind of makeup, and that's actually a pretty provocative, powerful image for me. And have you ever seen this one? This is actually called The Real Face of Jesus. What they did, they said, let's try and go and look at that particular ethnic, racial, cultural, geographical terrain and what do people look like, and see if we can't sort of create a composite of what your typical Galilean peasant would have looked like in that day. And I don't know. I mean, none of us know, but maybe that was a lot closer to what Jesus looked like than dreamy Jesus. In some more recent years, certain images have attracted me. This one attracts me. I don't know if I know exactly why, but in part it's because there's this look on his face. I see determination. I see somebody who's like gazing into the future and looking up to heaven, and somebody who is resolute and set on a way that he has embarked on. It grabs hold of me. It's kind of gritty and real. And this one, even though it's a bit of an artistic portrait, there's just something reflective, something contemplative, something that he's thinking some pretty deep and serious thoughts, which I think he did from time to time. And then this one, maybe not quite as much, but there's a certain thing about Jesus that he was so attracted to so many people. The people who had the worst reputation enjoyed hanging around Jesus because somehow he had the ability to put them so at ease. And I don't know, maybe this was how they experienced the love and gentleness of Jesus. So these images have kind of been helpful for me in recent years. But here's our question: Who do you say that Jesus is? And maybe here's our question: is will the real Jesus please stand up? Will the real Jesus please stand up? We would like to figure out who this real Jesus is. There are a couple of tendencies, a few temptations, and I would like to even say dead ends when it comes to trying to figure out who the real Jesus is. One of those is just very simply distorted images that we love to make Jesus in our own image. So there's socialist Jesus, and there's capitalist Jesus, and there's revolutionary Jesus, and there's hippie Jesus, and there's Jesus who rides a Harley Davidson motorcycle and not a Kawasaki, and there's tough guy Jesus, and there's Mr. Rogers Jesus. And one NFL football player says what he thinks about Jesus, he kind of sees Jesus as like 6'6", 260-pound defensive back who's just going to lay waste to the opposition. And Eagles, I know you would wish to have that kind of Jesus on your team today, but I'm sorry you don't. But you see, we're always trying to remake Jesus in our own distorted image. I jotted down this thought, and let me just read it with you. When Jesus fully supports all your positions, legitimizes all your preferences, and congratulates you on all your life choices, there is a really good chance that you're talking to a make-believe Jesus that you invented. when we don't like some things we find about Jesus, then what we do is we recreate a Jesus that is much more palatable to what we want him to be. And so we do that with these distortions. Now here's another mistake we make. Let me just call this a minimizing or an imbalancing, because we actually find something that's real and true about Jesus. But then we take that one thing and we make that the only thing about Jesus, and he's only that and he's nothing else. And that winds up becoming a problem, because then what happens is we're drawn to the one thing about Jesus that we like, and we can then avoid conveniently all the things that we don't like, which is what our kind of a bumper video is all about, just trying to say Jesus, he's not just that or this, but he's this and that. He's so much, he's bigger than what we imagine. He's a big God. There are so many different things that all come together. They coalesce and they reside together in Jesus. And together they make him the real Jesus that he is. And we need that real Jesus. I need that real Jesus. I believe you do as well. We need the real Jesus, this big Jesus, the Jesus who is all the different things that the stories say that he is, because that Jesus is the one who's able to forgive us for all that is wrong. And there's a bunch that is wrong in our life. He's the one who's able to heal all that hurts, and there's a lot that hurts in life. He's the one who's able to repair all that is broken. There's a lot that is broken in our life. He's the one who is able to kind of disturb all that's become complacent. He's the one who is able to ignite all that has become dormant. I mean, the real Jesus is able to do that for us, and that's what we need. We need a real Jesus, not a make-believe, pretend, not a limited, reduced, minimized Jesus. We need a real Jesus. The real Jesus is able to bring transformation into your life. The real Jesus is able to transform you with meaning, with purpose, with virtue, with wisdom, with energy, so that you can live the life that you've always wanted. I mean, hardly ever do I talk to somebody who says, Pastor Brian, no, my life really doesn't matter. I'm really not that interested in having a really good life. I almost never have that conversation. Now, I do have conversations with people who despair about having it, but I can't remember having a conversation when somebody says, I really don't want my life to matter. I really don't want my life to make a difference. I really don't want to add any value to the world. I really don't want the people in my life that I love to flourish. I really don't want the world to be a little better because I'm in it. I just don't have conversations with people who don't want those things. Now, I do have conversations with people who want those things but despair of getting them, which is why we need this real Jesus who wrote all those things as a black swan disruptive event to the first listeners 2,000 years ago. And through the long centuries, coming right down to today, the real Jesus is still doing that. That's why I want the real Jesus. That's why Philip Yancey wrote a book called The Jesus I Never Knew. I mean, he grew up in a church. He heard all kinds of things about Jesus, but he heard some limited things about Jesus and didn't hear the whole story about Jesus. And he heard some distortions about Jesus. And so he wrote a book about the Jesus I never knew. And I would like to add in the Jesus that we need to know. The real Jesus. And some people have called him a wild Messiah for a missional church. I love that phrase, a wild Messiah. Somebody else has called him this beautiful outlaw who is disruptive, who is extravagant, who is playful. That speaks to me. I think I need a Jesus like that. C.S. Lewis has cast him as the lion Aslan of Narnia. And you can't tame him, you can't control him, you can't hinder him, but he's coming to bring an end to the winter of our lives and to bring a spring that will go on forever. And Peter just simply says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That's the real Jesus I need, the real Jesus who's going to be big enough for all that I long, for all that I dream, for all that I miss, all that I don't have, all that's been taken away. That's the Jesus I need. That's the Jesus you need. That's the Jesus who offers himself to you and I. And so that's what these next 2 months are all about. We want to try and help the real Jesus become very real to you, because we believe that we need that very real Jesus. We would like to use the prayer from Godspell. So while the movie was kind of weird, but this is a good song. 3 things I pray. This is what we're praying and working for your lives for the next number of weeks. That you would see Jesus more clearly than you've ever seen, the big Jesus, that you would love him more dearly. I had an insightful conversation with an individual the other day who said, I'm interested in knowing more about Jesus, but what I'm afraid of is I don't treasure Jesus very much. Was that an amazing moment of self-insight and discovery and desire? To see him more clearly, to love him more dearly, and then seeing and loving the real Jesus, to then follow him more nearly, because it's as we follow him that we're going to discover what it is that we are looking for. How are we going to do that? How will we be able to see, love, and follow Jesus in a more significant way? Well, there's an author that's one of my favorite authors, Bobby Clinton, leadership professor, teacher at a major seminary in our country for many, many decades. And he has this very simple saying. It says, what you focus on expands. What you focus on expands. What you focus on begins to consume your attention, your interest, your thoughts. Right now, how many of us are consumed with the NFL playoffs? Well, because we're focusing on it, and everything around us is helping us focus on the NFL playoffs. What you focus on expands, so you have more interest and more passion and more energy and more time given to that. What you focus on expands. For about the last 3 months, I have been focusing on Jesus in preparation for the series. Now, it's not like I didn't think about Jesus before that. Of course I thought about Jesus. I'm a pastor. I've got to think about Jesus. I'm a Christian. I've got to think about Jesus. I always think about Jesus, but for the last 3 months, I have been thinking about Jesus much more. I've been reading the stories of Jesus much more. I've been reflecting on the stories much more. I've been pondering, what are the implications of the stories much more. My focus has so increased. It's like Jesus has to become very, very large in my awareness because I focus, and what you focus on expands for you. So we want to help you focus on Jesus. Look, let's just try and experiment for 2 months. Let's try and experiment and focus on Jesus, and let's see what happens when we focus on Jesus. I believe some really good things are going to happen as we focus on Jesus. We're going to help you focus on Jesus. So we've got 8 different messages, and really what each message is going to do, and today was kind of introductory, but for the rest of them, we're going to take one of those aspects of Jesus that it's true, it's right there in the Gospels, and we're going to take that aspect, and we're just going to try and help you understand that part of Jesus, and then the next week we'll do another, and by the time we're done, we haven't even gotten close to covering all of Jesus, but we would have given you like 7 portraits, 7 pictures, 7 substantial, biblical images. This is the real Jesus, and together they add up to something really big and powerful. Al Jacobs has written a book called The Year of Living Biblically. So he was kind of a somewhere between secular, quasi-observing Jew. And he said, I just want to spend a whole year focusing on the whole Bible, and that's what he did. And he was like adamant about it. He was almost obsessive about it. He just spent a year with relentless focus on the whole Bible. And he wrote a book about it called The Year of Living Biblically. It's quite a fascinating story about how everything in his life began to change from that focus. Well, we're not asking you to spend a year, but how about 2 months of giving some time and energy to focus on Jesus? So we launch it on Sunday mornings, and then we have many of you you love these things, and we pick them back up again. So we're going to give you a devotional resource that's going to springboard right off of what we talk about on Sundays and help you get into the stories, the words, and have your own encounters with Jesus. So, for example, this one, I mentioned that when Jesus appeared on the scene, he began to do things and say things that amaze people, astonish people. And so we're going to have you read some of the stories about those first weeks, months of ministry that Jesus did, and reflect about what does that mean for your life. We're going to do it week after week. It'll be one of the best ways that you can focus on Jesus, whether you take 10 minutes or 30 minutes or longer. We're going to help you focus on Jesus. We know that a number of small groups are studying more materials that we prepared about Jesus. Pastor Ned Keene, who leads our small groups ministry, he's resourcing groups to do that. And by the way, if you're a small group, you haven't quite figured out what you want to do and you need 2 months to, man, love to have you guys jump in the series. If you're actually here and you've never been a part of a small group, you'd like to, man, get hold of Ned Keene. But man, see, when we have conversations with others about Jesus, it helps us focus and learn and explore, and we connect and kind of splash around together in that living water.